The debate will come to order. The resolution that lies before the House today is as follows, starting with the info slide. Criminal charges carry a range of penalties and do not always include jail time, though they may. Other penalties often include loss of license, finesse, permanent records, and more. And so the motion follows as this House would criminally charge doctors who further the narrative of pandemic denial. Representing the government, its first speaker, Tinashe, second speaker, Bree, and third speaker, Ellen. Representing the opposition, first speaker, Serena, second speaker, Sherwin, and third speaker, Alexander. On behalf of the House, I'd like to express a sincere welcome to our judges and also introduce them each. So the first judge to introduce today, I'd like to introduce Aaron, who is a lawyer with litigation practice at MLT in Regina. Aaron has an LLM, JD, and BBA from the University of Cambridge, Saskatchewan, and Regina, respectively. Aaron has over a decade of debate experience and participated in the JDC West debate competition, winning first place in 2015 and third place in 2014. Also like to welcome Andrew, a lawyer practicing in wills and estates in Winnipeg. Prior to law school, Andrew attended the Asper School of Business at the U of M and competed in the debate competition at JDC West in January of 2012. He and the other teammates whose coattails he was lucky enough to ride on won that year's competitions, and those, of course, his words. We also have Michelle judging the debate today, who attended the University of Saskatchewan and graduated from the Edwards School of Business in 2010 and the College of Law in 2014. She's a lawyer and the executive director of House Business and Research in the Office of the Premier of Saskatchewan. Michelle started debating in 2002 and has been involved in JDC West debate since 2007, including finishing first place in 2008 and 2009. The next judge today will be Darka, who is the manager of missions and student services at the Red River College. She has judged debate competitions ranging from junior high to national competitions and has traveled across Canada to assist with coaching debaters. Also like to extend a welcome to our judge, Emily, who first began to debate in grade 7 and has since earned local, national, and international titles. Most notably, that of the 12th best overall speaker at the 2018 World Championships in South Africa. Her passion for debate and policy continues through her current role as treasurer of the University of Manitoba Debating Union and senator for the University of Manitoba. I will be your Speaker of the House today. You may refer to me as Speaker or Madam Speaker. We'll now go over the rules for this debate that are the same as throughout the competition. So each debater will deliver a 7-minute constructive speech, and anyone besides the silent will also deliver a 4-minute reply speech. I'll be counting down and providing time signals through the chat. These will be given as each minute passes, as well as a 30-second mark, ending with a 10-second countdown. There will be a hard stop for all speeches with no grace period. Once the time has elapsed, I'll unmute myself and ask you to stop speaking at this time. Points of information will be allowed during constructive speeches, but not during the first and last minute of these speeches, as that is protected time. POIs are also not permitted during the reply speech. Points of clarification are allowed, but may only be offered in the beginning half of the first government speech. Points will be deducted for any debater who interrupts another excessively or maliciously. Any speakers disconnected from the debate will be readmitted to the room during the transition between speeches. Anyone who's disconnected for more than 2 minutes becomes a silent for the remainder of the round to ensure the integrity of the competition. If you are disconnected during your own speech, we will wait for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, your teammates may finish speaking on your behalf or simply decide to end the speech. So note to the observers, please avoid using any of the reaction functions on Zoom. So unless there are any questions regarding the rules, we'll now start the round. Seeming as there is not, I would like to introduce the government case for a 7-minute speech.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. COVID-19 has undoubtedly been an unprecedented event. And similarly, the spread of misinformation about said event has also duly been unprecedented. At the root of this motion that we on side government are proposing is the question of how we can prevent the spread of misinformation from medical professionals. And underpinning our entire case as side government is the theme of protecting the safety of Canadians through ensuring the communication of accurate information. In my speech, I will give you some definitions of precisely what we mean by the terms that I have just used. I will provide you a specific model as to how our specific proposal will be fulfilled. And then specifically, I will give you some constructive on specifically the importance of why we're focusing on doctors centered around their responsibility in society. I will then close my speech by discussing how when people in power misuse or miscommunicate certain things, there's a loss in the public trust of important institutions. Our second speaker will discuss the COVID rhetoric and the impact of the spread of misinformation in the public sphere. And then our third speaker will talk about malpractice and malicious spread of misinformation. To get into some definitions. Firstly, when we say pandemic denial, we mean the assertion that the COVID-19 pandemic is not real or that it is not harmful. What would be included is things such as purporting that the pandemic is a government conspiracy, that all public health measures do not need to be followed because COVID-19 isn't real, or that simply it is not pandemic itself. Essentially, things that clearly connote the pandemic, denying the pandemic. What do we mean by doctors? All licensed medical doctors of any field, active or retired, who leverage their credentials in Canada. And then by criminal charges, we specifically mean, and consequences, we mean the loss of license, fines, and permanent records. Now I'll briefly discuss specifically how this looks in the world that we are proposing. So essentially under our proposal, doctors would be fined or have their license revoked from professional institutions and colleges following the order of the criminal courts on a case-by-case basis. Now, in terms of the real criminal consequences, we set out a framework that is consistent with the penalties that exist for ordinary citizens when they breach COVID restrictions. So for example, currently citizens, if they breach, they either face a $1,000 minimum or up to a year in jail time. For doctors, when they spread pandemic denial or misinformation, the $1,000 or year in prison is a baseline, and it can increase depending on the severity of the breach. So for example, a doctor speaking on his social media to 2 or 3 followers would be treated differently or with more greater severity, or the issue, a doctor who would be holding a wide conference to say would be treated with more severity than the former instance. So now I want to talk specifically about why we're targeting doctors and specifically their responsibility in societies. So it's a plain and simple, I'll take that POI before I get into my constructive.
Don't you think you're silencing doctors who have genuine concerns about the effects of the pandemic on things like psychology, on things like mental health, and will now be far too afraid to speak out because they risk losing their license and jail time?
Honorable Speaker, recognize that a doctor, for example, asserting that the mental health of individuals is suffering under the quarantine is completely different than a doctor saying that, for example, that COVID isn't something to be worried about, or it is simply a misnomer that it has no effect on your health as an individual. We're focusing specifically on doctors who are spreading tangible misinformation and not specifically their opinions about how the pandemic is impacting their clients. So specifically, when doctors are spreading misinformation about the pandemic that can ultimately be harmful to the mainstream consensus, that is what we're focusing on. And if doctors have concerns, they're still able to voice them. Now, talking about about the responsibility of doctors and why this motion is integral to the root issue that we presented forward. So I will take that POI later. Doctors hold an esteemed position in society, and both while on and off duty. They're extremely educated and have access to important information. So obviously, when they do so, they're either acting in when they spread misinformation, they're acting in their own self-interest, or they're spreading this information maliciously. But ultimately, they are the safeguards of the physical well-being of Canadians. When they act and speak in consensus, they have a lot of power and in their ability to change and influence the behavior of Canadians so that citizens engage in conduct that is beneficial to their own and the well-being of others. For example,
POI?
Dr. Teresa Temp, I will take that POI in a second, and other provincial medical chiefs and doctors have become household figures. And this is in part because of the importance that they hold as medical professionals. And then on a personal level, family and community doctors are even more important to being sources of guidance for individuals. So all doctors, whether very publicly visible or not in terms of influence, have the ability to influence people. This is why when they speak in a way that contradicts mainstream logic and reality, considering the pandemic, it is particularly harmful. All it takes is one doctor to spark a movement based on misinformation, and that is why we're proposing this legislation today. I will take a POI.
Sure. If doctors are as trustworthy as you say they are, what do you think a pandemic denier is going to think when all of the doctors that they've been following are suddenly locked up? Do you think they are more or less likely to trust their government?
So first things first, we stated that our model presents several options in terms of consequences, right? Firstly, the doctor will lose potentially their license, and then also on the other hand, this doctor can pay a fine, or should the case matter, they ultimately may be locked up. But here's the thing: yes, this pandemic denier may notice this doctor obviously being facing these consequences for what they're saying, but this communicates one of two things, and depending on their interpretation, that A, what that doctor is saying is wrong and is dangerous to society, or B, if they're simply looking for confirmation bias in the situation, they will simply interpret that as the government scheme. And at that point, then the damage already has been done, and that is an issue. So we're trying to prevent individuals from engaging in confirmation bias in the first place by addressing these matters before they get there. So as I was talking in my constructive, all doctors have a greater responsibility to communicate factual information because of their ability to influence behavior in modern Canadian society. Furthermore, the motion that we're presenting deters doctors from influencing discourse around the pandemic in an unhelpful way, and ultimately this is and because when they do so negatively, this hampers and undermines the creation of a universal and of a unified message. From medical officers. So what have I done? I have clearly modeled out specifically how we will do this. I have set the definitions for how we will proceed throughout the rest of this debate. And my two partners will continue discussing the COVID rhetoric and the impact of the spread of misinformation, and about specifically malpractice and malicious spread of information specifically. Thank you for your time.
I thank the member for their remarks. The time elapsed was 6 minutes and 57 seconds. We shall now hear the first speaker for the opposition.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, we came here today to have open debates as we recognize the strength of open communication and exchange of ideas. But when you shut up one side of the debate, you not only take away what might be a valuable input or thought, but you entirely kill the discourse and communication line where you can convince the other side of your ideas. And perhaps you might actually even incite anger and continued distrust from those that were cut off. And it is for this reason that we are so proud to oppose the motion at hand. Now, let me clarify side opposition's stance. Because of the state's responsibility to uphold and respect freedom of speech, we believe that criminal charges are outside of the means of the justice system to judge and control. We think that open discourse and sound, rational arguments are the best way to fight pandemic deniers. So what is our burden within this debate? Our burden is not to prove that we support COVID deniers, but rather we have to show you two distinct things. First of all, that this does not fall under the jurisdiction of a criminal offense. And secondly, even if it did fall under the jurisdiction of a criminal offense, this creates more harms on the discourse of the pandemic, but you seem to disagree.
Honorable Speaker, recognize that under Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Canada has the ability to reasonably limit things and therefore making it constitutionally acceptable if this is protecting the rest of society, which we believe it is. How do you reconcile this?
Thank you very much for bringing that up. That is actually the entire second point of my speech, which I will get into later on. But as far as we can say, we actually strongly disagree with this, and there are great ramifications to silencing these doctors. So allow me to signpost. Our first argument will be on criminality. Our second argument will be on the freedom of speech. And finally, my partner Sherwin will be discussing how we can best fight pandemic denial. So what did side government have to show you today? They had to prove to you that this speech that is coming out of doctors is so egregious to the point that it rises to a level of criminal conviction, and this will somehow better prevent the spread of COVID disinformation. We have some issues with this. First of all, with their model, who determines what is misinformation and what is harmful to the mainstream population? We think that this is very unclear and that no one really addresses this. Okay, I will take you in a second. And now onto their constructive. They said that doctors are thought leaders who should know better and are in positions of power. However, we think that this is not going to be relevant to the most prominent of doctors, like public health officers, because if they say these types of things, they'll be fired due to large public outcry. And secondly, criminal charges. If you criminally charge these doctors, we think you are actually giving them a larger platform because you're now pushing them into this public sphere, but you seem to disagree.
Honorable Speaker, to your point of the ambiguity, recognize that Health Canada has guidelines specifically that relates to the pandemic in general. So how does your point of ambiguity stand? And aren't you scared, again, about the undermining of the main political discourse and recommendations?
Okay, thank you for clarifying this, but actually we disagree. We don't think that this is going to undermine it. We think that what actually you are doing is undermining your goal because you are not allowing freedom of speech and you are not allowing this exchange of information, which I will get to in my constructive. Now, also, we also think that doctors took an oath to not harm any patients, the Hippocratic Oath. So this means that if they are speaking out, they truly believe that there are extreme problems within the status quo and that they need to be addressed for the betterment of people. This is very important. Okay, secondly, they also wanted to take away attention from these doctors, but this is where we have our main point, which I've already said multiple times in relation to the POIs. We think it's good to allow people to see discourse happening and incorrect messages being proven wrong by other medical professionals, because that way it allows people to think. I will get more into this in my constructive.
POI?
Now, first of all, no, I will not be taking any more POIs. What does it mean to get a criminal conviction? There's a very high burden when reaching a criminal conviction where laws need to be broken and people need to be tangibly harmed. So that means that there's irrevocable proof that someone was intentionally harmed, things like murder and assault. The closest thing we can get to in relation to this motion would be things like hate speech. However, hate speech is when you intentionally talk about and incite significant harm on a group of people beyond a reasonable doubt. Even with hate speech, we allow some hate speech to remain on the internet when it is in the public interest to see that information. Furthermore, even when you say things that are bad to other people, but there is minimal effect, there are things like civil suits that address this, like defamation, but we recognize and sometimes we even recognize that the law is outside of these bounds, and we therefore allow you to have freedom of speech.
POI?
Why is this important? I already said I'm not taking any more POIs. It's important that we don't characterize these as crimes, as criminal offenses, because they aren't. First of all, they did not have the intention to hurt others, as I've said in my rebuttal. Secondly, it did not directly hurt or incite violence against a group of people. Even if it did indirectly, in some case, cause some form of harm, it would fall under the purview of a civil suit. Thirdly, it is important that private citizens have the freedom of speech. That is why we don't criminalize these things. And moreover, in this particular case, private citizens have the option of choosing who they'd like to listen to, either the doctors that are furthering the pandemic denial, or they can choose to listen to a state official like a public health officer who says the opposite. Now onto my second point of freedom of speech. In a free society, you need to be able to express your beliefs without harms or the consequences insofar as they don't violate the laws. This is even more important in the scientific community because it is built on the principle of constantly attempting to prove what is true and what is not true about the world. There are many other times where a minority of doctors and scientists have been correct on certain topics, but have their voices censored or covered up by the government. What is the consequence of this? Restricting freedom of speech pushes discussion into a more hidden and less regulated platform. This means that it will separate people into two groups. It will lead one crowd to push ideas on Facebook, while others turn to applications like Parler or Gab, which ultimately enforce these self-fulfilling prophecies that we've mentioned that you guys actually mentioned earlier, and keeps these movements growing in these smaller and less public areas and means that they will never get killed. So why does censoring this speech make things even worse? Those who are convicted will wear it as a badge of honor. And secondly, sending those people to jail is a way to further send a message to people not to trust doctors and not to trust science. So we already see things on platforms like these where Tucker Carlson talks to on a nightly basis about censoring conservatives on social media platforms. And when this happens, it emboldens views that social media platforms are actually against them and are less likely to hear rational views. Now, in order to wrap up my speech, I'd actually like to address a very similar example across the pond. When the first Chinese doctor spoke up about the coronavirus, he was shut down by professionals in his community and the government silenced him. Why should we do the same in Canada?
I thank the member for their remarks. The time elapsed was 7 minutes. I now call upon the second speaker of the government.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Today on Side Government, we are happy to propose to criminally charge doctors who further the narrative of pandemic denial. I personally will be speaking about the rhetoric surrounding COVID currently, the age of misinformation that we live in, and specifically the importance of public buy-in and a unified narrative. However, before I get into that, and before I get into my clash, I want to kind of summarize where we're all at. I think it's fair to say that we all understand that COVID is real and COVID is a real harm. And we know this because of science that we have access to. So saying the importance of this is that pandemic denial, as we defined in our first speech, is saying that the pandemic is a government conspiracy, that all public health measures do not need to be followed, COVID isn't real, it's not a pandemic, essentially that it is not real and it is not harmful. So I think that's an important thing to reiterate and bring back to the scope of this debate. Now, getting into my constructive, we heard a few important things. I want to first kind of talk about this idea of criminality we heard, and that there needs to be intentional harm, kind of like hate speech. However, we talked about in our first speech the importance and responsibility of doctors in society, in which that they're considered knowledge holders and gatekeepers to public health, in which they have access to information and they have the ability to look at new studies and they see these scientific findings. So this kind of thing looks at two things when a doctor is perpetrating pandemic denial. Either they are completely ignorant to the pandemic, which is harmful in itself to their patients and to society, or they're not ignorant and they choose to ignore the facts of the matter, which is even more harmful because of the prominent effect that doctors have in society. I will not take a POI until I get into my constructive. So like we mentioned, doctors are in a position of power. They have the ability to misuse it. And I just want to reiterate the example in our first speech. It was one single doctor who made a false study on autism being called by vaccines. It was one doctor and it was disproven almost immediately. And yet there's an entire movement behind this that supports it. So no, it's not necessarily critical thinking can immediately solve the misinformation spread by leaders in our society. It is dangerous and it is harmful. And then I want to kind of go into this idea that we heard of freedom of speech. The first thing that I mentioned in my POI is in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under Section 1, our rights and freedoms can be limited under reasonable circumstances, especially if it causes harm to someone else. So for example, Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the right to security and quality of life. People are being harmed by COVID, and by spreading false information that may make people not follow public health guidelines, these people are being harmed and their quality of life is threatened. I will take a POI.
Madam, when you violate someone's freedom of speech, or you are taking reasonable action under the Constitution, you better have a very good metric to do so. The metric in hate speech is inciting violence. Here, it seems like you don't have a very clear definition of how much constitutes pandemic denial and what doesn't constitute pandemic denial.
Well, let's take a look at another limitation under freedom of speech then. Libel or slander, being able to prove that something is misinformation, it is false, and it is harmful being spread. Therefore, that can be easily applied to misinformation around COVID, especially in a criminal court of law where the cases are presented. Now, moving on into my constructive here, I want to first talk about the spread of information and the new tech age. This was kind of brought up in the first opposition speaker, so I'll be talking a little bit about both. So we already see with the use of social media that there is rampant misinformation being spread. Specific to COVID-19, we've seen a lot of racist narratives come out, specifically in Canada, East Asian Americans describe feeling 60% more unsafe in the pandemic because of harassment and discrimination. We also see an increase in populism and parties, which has led to a decrease in fact checking and rather just a trusting of the leader who may be leading based on charisma and fringe narratives. So we see that this is extremely harmful right now, and it is being exacerbated given the confusion and danger of COVID-19. People are looking for an expert opinion to turn to, and if they see a doctor as an expert who is spreading information, they can have a valid excuse to ignore COVID protocols that are further harming people who are further getting infected in these at-risk groups. And so as it stands, social media platforms do not moderate this content to a full extent. Rather, having fact check on some materials further validifies those that are not fact checked and could still be untrue. I'll take a POI.
When the governments take deniers out of the public sphere, these doctors will then move to unregulated platforms where people can't check them, tell them they're wrong. Isn't that more harmful to misinformation under your side?
That was actually my second point, so thank you for that segue. That is exactly why we are not turning to social media to further moderate or ban these people, but rather taking action offline. So these fines, these discouraging behaviors, potential loss of license. So just because people are having punishments doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be silenced, but rather have to face the harm of what they're doing. So specifically, we see these echo chambers, which was mentioned, and which is why we are not doing social media. And the reason why we don't believe discourse is going to be helpful in changing a doctor's opinions, which was suggested, was because they're already in an academic sphere. They are already engaging with people who know this knowledge, who are scientific, who pursue this knowledge, and yet their opinion has still not changed. So no, we don't believe them going on Twitter and posting about it and having someone get into a Twitter fight with them will change their mind and will benefit society in general. Next, my point of public buy-in. So public buy-in is really important right now because we are in a public health crisis, and we can only get out of this with the cooperation of all of society. So doctors spreading misinformation can lead to a massive loss of trust in the medical community. So for example, in Canada, we've seen a lot of politicians go against their own guidelines, and we've seen a lot of competing narratives there. And a lot of people don't trust politicians anymore to make the right decisions for them. So we can potentially see this happen in people not trusting provincial doctors, for example, Dr. Theresa Tam federally, and they could be undermined by these rogue doctors spreading this misinformation. And then a unique harm that exists for this public buy-in under the status quo is those who are working on the front lines or those in vulnerable communities. For example, Indigenous communities have had a very rocky history with the medical community, and there is rightfully so a lot of distrust there. We need to make sure that we limit all the distrust as possible to make sure we can properly help and protect the vulnerable communities. So what have I talked about? I've talked a lot about why it is important to prevent the spread of information, especially from those in positions of power and those who are seen as experts. And I've also talked about the importance of public buy-in and a unified narrative. And for these two reasons and the other ones we'll go over today, I'm happy to propose.
I thank the speaker for their remarks in that speech totaling 6 minutes and 58 seconds. I will now call upon the second speaker of the opposition.
Can everyone hear me okay? Ladies and gentlemen, side government is going to lose this debate because they have fundamentally forgotten who we need to care about. It is not people who already believe that vaccines are effective that need to be convinced. It is not people who already are following public health guidelines and doing the right thing. The people that we really need to try to convince in this debate are people who are either A, on the fence, or B, who already distrust the government. And I'm going to show you why in this speech, we actually get better outcomes for these people. We are more likely to convince them on our side and far less likely to convince them if we shut these pandemic deniers up. I wanted to do three things in this speech. First, take down everything we've heard from their side. Second, rebuild my partner's points. And lastly, tell you why this is actually the worst possible way to deal with the pandemic. But before I do that, I want to note that their model is extremely unclear in this debate. And this is a flaw we pointed out right from the first speech, because we think that when you're violating something as fundamental as someone's freedom of speech, you need to have a clear calculus under which you do that. We think with things like hate speech laws, that calculus is inciting violence against a group. With this, the line is far more shaky. Insofar as a doctor comes out saying that there are the pandemic has caused depression, or there are massive economic effects that harm child growth at a young age, we think that that is grounds for pandemic denial. Or at the very least, even if that is not found to be pandemic denial in a court, the doctor will fear that it will be and will be scared to voice those points of view. So even if this was clear legally, it is not clear from a perception standpoint, and that's going to silence a lot of people. They need to have a much clearer metric, and fundamentally, we don't think it's possible to have a clear metric in this case, and that's why we don't think their points stand. But let's look at what they said. They said basically one point. First, that doctors are trustworthy, and second, as kind of like an add-on to that, the public needs to buy into the pandemic efforts and the government's efforts, and we can't do that when we trust doctors that say bad things. But first, the most trustworthy doctors that we're talking about in this case are public officials. It's not likely that they're going to spread misinformation. Otherwise, they're going to get fired. And we think that that already exists under the status quo. But we think that the reason, I'll take you in a second, the reason why this distrust exists is because of people who fundamentally already don't trust the government. And that's exactly what I'm going to be clashing with in my constructive. I'll take your POI now.
Honorable Speaker, when you make public officials, don't you recognize, though, that community doctors and your family doctors have just as significant an effect on your behavior as an individual than these public officials, and we should also hold these doctors accountable as well?
I absolutely understand that. And that's why I think that if you really trust your doctor, your private doctor, because you go to them for advice, when that doctor gets locked up, you're far more likely to distrust the government, having been fed years of fake nonsense about how that pandemic wasn't real in the first place. I'm going to analyze this more in my constructive. So moving on to reconstruction, because we brought you a point on how this doesn't actually fall under the definition of criminality. Note that this is extremely important, because regardless of any of the effects, regardless of whether this is good for the pandemic or bad for the pandemic, the question is not whether this will help the pandemic or not. The question is, should this be a crime, right? Insofar as we win that, we think that government has lost this question. We told you that a crime has to be intentional. You have to cause or incite some kind of violence or damage against another individual. The only response that they have is Section 1 of the Constitution. But I told you that if you're going to violate that, you have to have a very clear metric for deciding what constitutes a fundamental human right. No, thank you. They bring you the examples of libel or slander, but we actually told you that more often than not, those are pursued as civil suits. Why? Because it's extremely hard to prove direct harm as a result of libel or slander, and therefore it's basically never criminally prosecuted. It's mostly prosecuted in civil suits. But second, we brought you so therefore this is important because we won the theme of criminality. But secondly, on freedom of speech, we told you that even if this perception is easy to adjust legally, the fear of being criminally prosecuted, even if what you're saying is right and doesn't fall under this definition, is going to silence a lot of doctors who have views that are important, who talk about mental health, who talk about child development when they don't go to schools. They told you that this discourse isn't going to change because we're already in academic sphere, but we do think that there's some value in hearing these arguments, and these people are less likely to speak out when there's pressure on them.
POI?
No, thank you. I'll now get into my third point about why this is actually the worst way to deal with the pandemic. So I'll actually engage with them on that question as well. So even I've already proved why it's not criminal, but let's talk about why it's a bad way to deal with the pandemic. First, who is likely to buy into pandemic denial? This is the crucial thing that government misses, because we're not talking about people who already believe that the pandemic is real. We're talking about people who are either on the fence or people who already distrust the government. For both of these types of people, we think they are more likely to buy into pandemic denial when deniers are shut up or they are censored. Why? Number one, because we think that when you find out that let's say you're sitting on the fence, you've lost your job, and you're wondering whether this pandemic is real or not. We think in that situation, you are far more likely to agree with those who are defending your ability to open back up the economy, who are arguing for more opening of the economy and arguing for you to get your job back, right? Therefore, you're more likely to naturally agree with those doctors. When those doctors are thrown in jail, you are going to feel like that is an additional action taken against you, that the government is silencing views that you fundamentally agree with and views that are going to help you feed your family at the end of the day. No, thank you. As a result, people who are sitting on the fence are likely to get far more frustrated when the people they follow and the people they believe are fighting for them are shut up. Either they have their licenses removed, they are fined, or put in jail. Lastly, those who distrust the government are going to continue to do so, and they're going to do so even more on their side of the house. We think you create martyrs to these causes when these trials are publicized on places like Fox News, or in Canada, we would say on more conservative news stations, right? That creates a lot of damage for this cause because these people are far more likely to buy into that. Lastly, we think you actually create these circles where people are constantly communicating. Even if these doctors don't express their views online or they don't express their views publicly, you create these sort of like cells that fester because people are too afraid to speak out. We think the talk there is far more likely to be more radical against the government. Crucially, what is the harm of this? First, that people feel disenfranchised. The people you're trying to help feel more isolated. Second, they're less likely to accept things like vaccines. That means that you're more likely to get a health harm because we agree that it requires public buy-in. And lastly, it doesn't enable the government to actually deal with this. Why? Because at the end of the day, they don't have the political capital to do so when the public distrusts them more. At the end of the day, we protect free speech and we solve the pandemic. So proud to oppose.
I thank the member for their 7-minute speech. I now call upon the third speaker for the government.
Am I audible? All right, hello, honorable speakers. So today in my speech, I'll be talking a little bit about malpractice, negligence. I'll also be talking about the position of power these doctors in, and like even the hierarchy sometimes within the medical field, and how if some of these doctors, especially if they're at the top of this hierarchy, spreading this misinformation could be extremely damaging. And also given the nature of some of the patients they work with, having some underlying health conditions and issues, this is a super important motion to consider. With this being said though, and I think I want to unite everything I'm going to talk about today under this idea of like preserving life, ensuring that more people live. That is our mandate on our side of the house. That is what we're trying to do. That is what we achieve better than the opposition. So I want to get into a few points of refutation here just to clean everything up. So the first thing to get out aside off is this idea that our model is unclear, that doctors will feel like they can't express genuine concerns, and that we don't have a clear calculus, so therefore this can't be a law. The first thing I want to say is so little in law has a clear calculus. Like that's the reason we have court. It's because so rarely is there a clear calculus. You're charged with the crime, there's a hearing, there's like each side presents some like information, and a judge at the end of the day decides if the case stands, what should happen, interprets the law. So it's really bogus to claim that we can't implement this because there's no clear calculus. We've set a framework. We think that the legal system that we have set up in Canada allows for it, and that we have excellent judges who will be able to implement this effectively. So that is what we say to that point. They also claim that this will harm public discourse and that doctors will be afraid of saying everything and then be like fear talking about mental health. We fully disagree with this. We think like for something to actually go to like criminal court, and as we outlined in our model, like it has to be pretty severe undermining of the pandemic and its fundamental danger. Like talking about mental health and its importance, sure, it's absolutely important. In the discussion for different viewpoints, that's something that's out of the scope of this debate. What we are talking about is spreading dangerous misinformation, underplaying like how severe the pandemic is. That is what we're speaking about. So we think this is bogus as well. I want to talk about this idea that everyone's going to go to fringe groups. So Parler, Gab, etc. The first thing I say here is these fringe groups are getting more and more inaccessible. Parler doesn't even know if it'll come back. So it's this idea that side opposition gives us that like if people see doctors getting locked up, then everyone's going to turn against the government and distrust them. I want to say here that, first of all, locked up is the extreme end of what we're proposing, and they keep on saying that we're locking doctors up. That is not what we're doing. At the base end, it's like a fine, and this would be, in a lot of cases, I think, probably what's implemented to ensure they don't continue to do this. this. So to say that there's going to be a massive public outcry and we're locking up all the doctors, I think overplays this issue. But I also want to talk about like, who are these two groups? So side opposition gives us these two groups that they think are impacted. One of the groups is these people that harbor extreme views. One of these groups is the people on the fence. We would tell you that the people that like are kind of QAnon and like really on the fringe and super right wing and maybe distrust the government, not at this time. These people are there, and neither side, opposition nor government, brings these people to be more centrist. They may use like this lobbying existing as like ammunition. We don't think, however, that this will make more people go to the fringes. And we also tell you that opposition doesn't give a mechanism to bring these people back. But this is the group I want to focus on. And they did rightly point out that it's people on the fence that we are worried about. And here's what happens when those people who are on the fence then are implement or hear some of this rhetoric going on by doctors. So what happens is if they hear it in the doctor's office, if they see it on Facebook, they might take COVID-19 less seriously. They might be more complicit. They might not follow some of the public health regulations, and they might spread it. And that there, ladies and gentlemen, these fringe people, these people kind of in the center that are on the fence, then spreading it is what leads to loss of life. And that is what we give you on side government. I will take a POI at this point.
At the start of the pandemic, Health Canada's guidelines were that masks were not effective. China's government censored doctors in Wuhan who said COVID does not spread to humans. When science depends on challenging narratives as new information becomes available, aren't we going to miss the next pandemic or a new public health tool if we give government the authority to shut down opinions that they feel are wrong?
Sure, and it is certainly important to challenge some of these notions. And that is why, at the end of the day, as we learned more about the pandemic, we now know its severity. So if we look at COVID-19, sure, at the start, we didn't think masks were that effective. Now we know. And that is why it's dangerous then when doctors go out and tell people masks are not effective and we don't need this anymore and the pandemic, it's not real. That causes the loss of life. So like we learn more as like a medical community, as a society, and it's important then once we know better, you do better, to quote Maya Angelou. So it's really important that we know this stuff and we need to act on it. And that's what we do on our side of the house. I want to talk a little bit more about doctors don't. So they talk about like doctors never intend to hurt others when they make these statements. I think this segues into my constructive nicely. They tell us that doctors never intend to hurt other people when they make these statements. We can't criminally charge them, therefore. The first thing is like a crime doesn't need to be intentional for it to be a crime. Like if I hit someone with my car by accident, that was still a crime. Like it doesn't need to be intentional. So this fully falls when we think this is bogus. But I think to some extent, and this is important, doctors to some extent do know and do this a little bit intentionally. Doctors often know better, not at this time. So for example, doctors, like they've gone through years of medical training, they know a lot about this stuff, they know virology, they know how things spread. And so ladies and gentlemen, like when you know all this information and then you continue to undermine it, that to some extent is intentional. That is a massive issue. And this, like my whole point for my constructive about like malpractice and negligence, I want to give you two situations to elucidate this, hopefully. So, for example, say you're a doctor, not at this time, and you have a patient that has a chronic illness, and the doctor discovered this, but didn't tell them to the extent of the harm. They underplay it because they didn't think it was necessary for them to know. I would be pretty angry if I was that patient, and just for society's benefit in general. But then similarly, what if a patient had like that similar chronic illness and the doctor told them they didn't have to worry about COVID-19, it's not really that bad? They would be complicit in holding back valuable information from patients. And this is malpractice, this is criminally liable, and this undermines their fiduciary responsibility, not at this time. So what do we give you on our side of the house? We give you criminal charges. These present the opportunity to take them out of the position of power in a permanent way and prevent the spread of this misinformation. Fundamentally, loss of lives, ladies and gentlemen. I want to emphasize that. That is what we prevent from happening, loss of lives on our side of the house. And then also in a healthcare setting, like it's especially important because often it's hierarchical. Maybe if it's like an older doctor that has these beliefs and harbors these beliefs, if they're like, their word is like gold a lot of the time in these instances. So if they're then disseminating that down to some of the people that work under them, this is particularly dangerous, especially when we need to be under united front fighting this pandemic together. That is so fundamentally important. So ladies and gentlemen, for reasons that I've presented and just reasons of like preserving life in Canada, I'm so proud to propose the motion today. Thank you.
I thank the member for their speech. The time elapsed was 7 minutes. The third opposition speaker will now deliver their speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, the final speaker, or the third speaker on government today, comes up and talks about a united Canada. But there's a problem in that. This country is extremely divided. And what side government never wants to engage with are those that deny COVID, and there's almost no way to win them over, but they also don't want to talk about people on the fence. We think these are the two primary actors in this debate because they are the ones who we actually need to convince that COVID is a problem and they need to follow these public safety measures. We think government spends the vast majority of their case talking about people who are already following these protocols, who already believe in COVID and see it as a problem. These are not the people who we need to convince are not the people who are important in this debate. That's where we think we've clearly differentiated ourselves today on opposition. What I'm going to do as a third is look at 4 different issues in this debate. First, if we criminally charge these doctors, are the views that they carry going to go away? Second, what is best for the people who are on the fence? Third, are COVID deniers actually going to come around? And fourth, what is going to be best in a future pandemic? Let's start with number A, letter A. If we criminally charge these doctors, are these views going to go away? What they tell you is that people trust doctors and that people are going to listen to doctors. A few points. First off, we would say that if you have like a family doctor or a doctor you go to a lot, you have a close relationship with that doctor and you trust them. If they give you that advice and you want to take it, that is your prerogative as a person to do. If you don't believe in COVID, you can simply leave that doctor and go to another doctor if you don't like their opinion, right? We think that's a choice we give to people, right? Whether they want to have that or not, right? We think that is something that exists there. But next, they bring up this idea of like constitutionally liable, slander, all that. First off, we would say that their definition was very, very difficult, right? They say that COVID deniers are people who are denying the harms of COVID. But we think that's harms relative to what, right? Because if a doctor comes out and says, yes, we think the harms of something else are much greater, to some extent that is denying how great the harms to COVID are, right? So we think that's a relative basis. We also think, and this is a very key point, it's not a slam dunk you win these trials. It's not a slam dunk these doctors get convicted. We say it's often very hard, as Sherwin tells you, to convict people on these grounds. No, thank you. And that is why a lot of the time it goes to civil trials instead. We would say, though, in the case which the government loses, which is a very plausible case that government doesn't want to engage with, this is just going to further embolden these people. Because now not only does it say, yeah, we were right, it says we beat the government, we are better than the government, and we know what we're doing more than the government does in a court of law. We think all that does is embolden those people to push harder on their ideals, and it legitimizes them to the general public who now says, yeah, actually, the government did lose. If this was a slam dunk concrete thing, they should have won this. What is the problem here? We think that leads to further issues. I'll take a POI.
Honorable Speaker, don't you think there's a difference between losing a case and believing that the pandemic is not a real thing?
Yeah, there is, but that only contingent if you win the case, which again, we think is very, very difficult to do. And we think that quite frankly, we are going to lose some of these cases if we try them, right? It's very, very difficult in a lot of cases to say like one sentence or a social media post has a direct tangible harm that the government is going to be able to prove 100% of the time, right? In a lot of these cases, they're going to lose, that's going to be public, and that's going to be a large problem. But next, let's talk about these positions of power, right? We think first off that, again, very prominent doctors are not going to say this because they're going to get fired, right, pretty much immediately. We're not going to see Theresa Tam be like, yeah, COVID's not real, right? You're going to get fired for that. But second off, we think there are a lot of views that you're going to shut down that are not mainstream views in the medical community, because now doctors are afraid at any point to come out and talk about problems, right? We think, just as a very common example, right, smoking for a long time was thought to be good for your health, but we had doctors eventually and scientists who did research to challenge that idea, right? At the time, it was extremely unpopular and not popular in mainstream society, and if government would have censored it, it would have been extremely harmful, right? We think this is a precedent you set to future pandemics that's going to make it extremely worse. And lastly, they tell you, well, it's only a fine. We tell you, though, that it's going to be public, and that's going to be galvanizing people, right? Well, we told you specifically why, A, that they can lose these criminal trials, but B, why there's a very, very high barrier to criminally charging people, right? We told you that why there are specific cases in which criminal trials work and when they don't, and we think we evidently proved here why this is not a criminal case that should be tried. But next, let's talk about people on the fence, right? We think that this is very important and arguably the most important because they're most likely to sway sides. We think what happens when you censor these doctors is not shut down the conversation, you actually amplify, and you amplify it on all platforms, whether that be underground platforms like Parler or you do it on Facebook. Because what people now are is more angry, more mad, and they want to promote these causes. This makes it much more difficult because government can't just censor doctors. Now they have to worry about the thousands and thousands of people who are spreading this in the face of saying, look, our doctor or this person we look up to is now censored by the government. We have to carry on their message, right? We think that that is going to be a large problem, and that people on the fence are now even more likely to see content that is in support of COVID denial, because more and more people are energized, are galvanized, and are looking to get back at the government to push their message. That makes it actually worse for people on the fence. We think we've clearly already won this point because government is not even engaging with this.
QI.
But second up, let's take a look now at COVID deniers. Are they going to flip over? We want to do actor analysis, right? Because we would say that COVID deniers are the people who are very hardline, right? They are saying like, look, COVID denial is not real. And we say they have a large distrust for the government just in general. They're obviously a lot of the times disenfranchised. They don't like wearing masks, all of those things, right? What we think is going to happen when you censor them is you again further push this message that government doesn't support my views, government doesn't care about me, government doesn't want to listen to me. We think when you do that, you further push that disenfranchisement button that throws these people out into society farther and farther away from trusting the government and makes it even more difficult to eventually buy into that government. We find it really ironic that side government actually brings up First Nations and how we need First Nations people to trust us. But ladies and gentlemen, a large reason why First Nations group don't trust us on healthcare is because we pushed medicine down their throat. We pushed our ideals down their throat against their best wishes, and they are irreparably harmed by that, right? We think that is very similar to a lot of the other disenfranchised people, where we are pushing things down their throats that they don't believe, albeit, not to the same extent that harm is going to be caused to them, right? But we think it's very similar in why they're not going to trust us as well. What did we tell you? We told you specifically why many of these people are now not going to come over, but just again are going to feel even more empowered, more ingrained. But lastly, let's talk about the consequences for the next health emergency. Because what we think this is going to cause is scientists, is doctors who are going to be afraid to challenge the common conceptions in society. They're going to be afraid to challenge government. They're going to be afraid to say, look, I disagree, and here's why. We think that significantly reduces the meaningful conversations that we have for future pandemics, for future health emergencies, and ensuring that our government is best prepared to deal with these arguments, because if doctors don't talk about them, they won't be able to do so. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I thank the member for their remarks. The time elapsed was 6 minutes and 54 seconds. At this time, there will be a 2-minute break while teams prepare their reply speeches. We will now hear a 4-minute reply speech from each team, starting with the opposition.
Can everyone hear me okay? I want you to imagine for a minute that you are someone who has recently lost your job, who's been unemployed for the past few weeks and don't really know how you're going to be able to feed yourself or your family. You see someone on TV, a doctor, who somehow tells you that, you know what, the effects of the pandemic or the effects of these lockdowns are actually worse than the effects of the pandemic themselves. And when that doctor is prosecuted and held criminally accountable for the things that he says, I want you to ask yourself if you are more or likely to trust the government that prosecuted that doctor or to agree with that doctor's viewpoints because they confirm your own internal biases and feel like you are further victimized by that very government. I want to ask two questions in this debate to show you why we won on opposition. First, should this be considered criminal? And second, does this solve the pandemic? So first, should this be considered criminal? This is the most important issue because regardless of the practical effects on solving the pandemic, the implementation and criminalizing this was the most important question, right? We can have other ways of kind of solving the pandemic. We told you that crimes have to be direct and they have to be clear. They told you that Section 1 gives us justification to do this. We have a few responses. First, that insofar as their third speaker wants to tell us that malpractice and negligence already exist, we think that at best, it means that their motion does absolutely nothing different insofar as the malpractice and negligence they want us to talk about already exists in the status quo. But at worst, it creates another law, which is an even more arbitrary scale on their side of the house. But second, they never clarified what this scale was likely to be, other than to say that judges make tough decisions all the time. But judges make tough decisions on cases with clear laws and clear metrics. That is not the case in the model we got down the bench from their side of the house. Because as Alex brought you in his third, these harms have to be argued based on context. We think that when you raise views that say the harms of the pandemic outweighed the benefits of this pandemic, that is a form of pandemic denial to minimize the effect of that pandemic and could still be argued on their side of the house. They wanted to tell you that their model was clear and these harms are going to actually get prosecutions. But we would note that criminal prosecutions require an extremely high burden of proof. That means at best, Proposition's world is highly ineffective at actually getting prosecutions on these doctors. But at worst, it means that a lot of these bad doctors get prosecuted, win their cases, don't get convicted, and are validated in the points of views in which they communicated. They need to deal with that on their side. Regardless of any of this, whether or not this is a clear legal terms or legal basis for criminal prosecution, the perception is unclear and the fear of getting prosecuted is extremely real. That means that people are far less likely to reach out and they still need to engage with that on their side of the house. Doctors are less likely to share their opinions because they fear prosecution. So second, does this actually solve the pandemic? We told you that the most important actor in this debate was people who are not convinced, right? Because people who are already convinced, we don't really need to worry about them. They want to tell you that doctors spread fake news and it convinces people. We think that there are much better ways of convincing people, like publicly demonizing them on platforms like Facebook, like online platforms. We think that if you force these people to be more secretive in the way they communicate, they move away from those platforms into secretive cells where there is absolutely no opposing voices, and you are far more likely to believe them because there's no opposing view. We crucially told you that this worsens our ability to combat pandemic deniers on a whole. They never actually dealt with this. The harms we give you of disenfranchising these communities more, that you get less vaccine acceptance because people are less likely to trust the government, and you get less political capital to engage in things like lockdown. At the end of the day, so proud to oppose.
I thank the member for their speech. The time elapsed was 3 minutes and 55 seconds. We will now hear the proposition's reply speech.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. So from side opposition, we've gotten two main questions, and specifically that is based on the basis of criminality and also on the basis of discussion of free speech. We started out our case by asking specifically, how can we prevent the spread of misinformation from medical professionals? And fundamentally, we believe that we have answered that question because we first addressed that there's a unique harm from doctors spreading misinformation. doctors have a unique position in society. And when they spread misinformation, this can have massive ripple effects that result in massive consequences on the rest of society. And that is why, if we want to ensure that we are limiting the spread of misinformation, we need to focus on doctors. Because when you are sick, being sick is a very vulnerable position. And doctors have, again, as I stated, a huge power in their ability to influence the thought and discourse of individuals. So let's talk about the side opposition government argument around the idea of free speech. So they stated that it is not within the jurisdiction of the government and nor the purpose of the government to limit the free speech of individuals. We showed you that, again, it is within the specific powers of the government to do so. And because there are unique, tangible, consequential harms to these doctors spreading this misinformation, it is 100% and reasonable to both limit their free speech of these doctors, as well as establish criminality to them, because ultimately criminality is about stopping individuals from engaging in behaviors that put the safety and security of the state at risk. And if doctors are spreading misinformation and leveraging their position in society that they have been given to spread this misinformation, that means that they are fundamentally threatening the safety and security of our society, and that is sufficient to establish a criminality on them. Now, specifically, they talked about they want to prevent that our proposal will prevent discourse in the public sphere. And they use the example of the doctor in China, and specifically the changes in the COVID protocols from Health Canada. First, the Chinese doctor was silenced by a regime that seeks to preserve its public image above all else. Secondly, medical information and recommendation chains, yes. But at the center of this debate is the question of pandemic denial. We know that pandemic denial is real, and we know the tangible repercussions that has. This is a wholly different matter from the examples that they have raised. And this is ultimately why, to the point of free speech, we have shown you that A, it is justifiable for government to do so, and that it is necessary for government to stop these doctors, again, because of the position that they have and their ability to sway the public discourse in public information. Now, there was also a lot of discussion about people on the fence, specifically how our proposal doesn't address specifically these people on the fence and pull them back from believing what they believe. First, COVID deniers and people on the fence are above all else seeking authority to confirm their beliefs or disprove them. If we remove doctors who deny the pandemic from positions of authority, this prevents their ability to sway individuals over the edge and become COVID deniers in the first place. We are essentially taking out their microphone away, and their medical credentials, which means that we're removing the authority that they have to ultimately convince the people who are on the fence. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why in our proposal, we are addressing the people who are on the fence. Then there was also discussion of the idea of hardliners. First, you can't win everyone, and that is not what we're trying to do on side government. We are focusing on those people, again, who are on the fence. And also, if someone is in such an echo chamber that they believe that everything that the government does is fundamentally like a conspiracy and a component of government action, the best that we as side government can do is clearly communicate that these beliefs and these actions are harmful to society, are effectively harmful to society, and that we, in our basic values, disapprove of them. And by establishing this misinformation spread and pandemic denial by doctors as a criminal offense, this therefore communicates that we very fundamentally believe this. With this, we rest the case of side government. Thank you for your time.
I thank the member for concluding the debate in that 4-minute speech. Unless there are any objections from the judges, the competitors may now sign off. Thank you.
Great job, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.